I suggested earlier that you use footnotes at the bottom of the page to develop discussions in your draft so that you are talking to one another, or you're talking to yourself, actually. Your footnotes or your comments can variously be flipped into the text, or the text be flipped into the footnotes, so that you're using this in a kind of creative fashion. Endnotes, those notes that are at the end of the chapter, serve a similar purpose, of course, but allow the text to be cleaner. And there are options in the manner in which notes are held. The social science approach is to insert the citation, that is the date and the author, the author's name and the date of the publication in the parentheses in the text. Well, that depends on how many of these authors you're going to throw at the reader. Because there's nothing worse than seeing an entire page which is quote, 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 right? It just chops up the amount of, well, text is as you might imagine, you've seen this. Your eyes jump, and before you lose any continuity of thought, because you're thinking about the sources. Oh, that source, this source, that source, right? Think about how you're making use of references, is what I'm saying. For those of you who are familiar with legal texts, right? For those of you who had the pleasure of taking a law course, if you do the review of a law article, a law review, will have in the footnotes long discursive notes in the opinion, pro and con, pro and con. The actual article itself is relatively brief, but the content of the footnotes is actually the meat of the matter. Because successively, what happens is the lawyers look at the pro and con that's developed in the footnote as the material, the raw material that is useful in what it is they're litigating in the next case, right? So think about the accessibility of your material in that regard. And I've reviewed that for you a little bit further there. Well, we're coming to the end. Yes, question?
Quick question. You use the term illustration in here, but do you mean an illustration like a children's book, or I assume you mean something else?
That's right. Interleave the illustrations and put short references to the bibliography in parentheses. The question of where you put illustrations, that's a very, very good question. Most people today, because of Microsoft's flexibility, can plant an image in the text. The problem with that is that you will find at the end the illustrations jump from one page to the next. So I generally recommend develop the text completely, develop the illustrations on separate pages, interleave them at the outset, then when you come to the final draft, flip it around so that you can absorb the illustrations you need. That's generally the easiest. The introduction and the conclusion have 3 parts. And this is whether it's a thesis or whether it's a project report, it makes no difference. You should clearly define the nature of the problem and indicate why the subject is worthy of examination. Remember, you did that in the template, handy thesis note number 107. That should be no difficulty for you. It defines the approach or methodology which will be used in the investigation. We've discussed that, right? So it should be no difficulty. And it suggests briefly the order of the chapters or the sequence of the discussion that follows and their content, stopping short of a sneak preview of the results of your study. You see the introduction, which you write at the end, and notice it's in the sequence at the beginning and the end of the things you will do, will actually be completely right on accurate, right, after you've done everything else. So you're revising your introduction, right, to fit what it is that you're introducing, right? So I make comments about, how is the information gathered, and how it is that the sequence is spelled out. But the conclusions parts are likewise threefold. Antithesis sheet number 601. It presents the nature of the findings, it recognizes the limitations and omissions of your study, and it raises further suggestions and questions for other investigations. The first should be logical if, in fact, your material has been presented correctly in the sequence of chapters, because, in fact, that's what you found, right? The second is generally the questions that have arisen, that are in your footnotes or in your notes, that you don't have the time to address. As it says in the third paragraph, with a little reflection, the limitations should be obvious. First, there was never enough time. There is never enough time to do everything. You have to recognize that this is just a contribution. This is just one snapshot. This is one example. This is one place. It's not everything. And you can state that explicitly, right, within the context of your work. What are the other limitations, right? Often these come to mind when you think about what you would have done if you knew then what you know now, which is at the end of the process, okay? And then, of course, several questions are certain to occur to you during the last months when you don't have time to address them, and you pawn those off into the realm of some unsuspecting master's student in the future, right? You make suggestions. The abstract in a thesis, it's not required in other forms, but the abstract of the thesis is basically putting together the introduction and the conclusion and writing it to stand instead of the entire work. It's not the same as writing another introduction, nor is it the same as writing a conclusion. But you marry them and change the tense of the verbs and the manner in which you construct the substitution, basically, for what it is that you do. If you want in one paragraph or 3 paragraphs, no more than that, to say what it is that you've done here, it will stand, it'll be standard in substitution for everything you've done. Questions? Sure.
Go back for a second to number 105.
105, okay. We'll go back to 105.
The difference between objective and deductive.
Yes.
I'm wondering what we should watch out for if we're focusing on a case study. If that's our primary focus.
That's very good. Good question. What about, what dangers are there with using a case study? Because in fact, in some cases, it seems to be rather more inductive than deductive. Generally speaking, they're the problems that you have with all inductive reasoning. That is, that you have to be careful not to overgeneralize. What you'll find is that that can be, in many senses, guarded against because you should have a strong context statement and rationale for the choice of the example that you have selected, okay? So that you're not, right from the get-go, you're never imputing or attributing to the case study more than it can deliver. Good question, though. Good question. And it is with project reports often an Achilles heel. You're absolutely right. Yeah, sure.
If we're saying research that is in a different language,
Yes.
in your in a bibliography, do we translate and provide the English as well as the original language titles, or how does
The
one...
title generally, but it varies depending upon whether, you see, if you were to do that in French, nobody would, or Spanish, nobody would holler if you just did an isolated title in French or Spanish. If in fact your work is, though, depending upon Spanish or French sources, or Chinese, or Mandarin sources, as the case may be, or whatever language, then you take the time to be specific about the title. Yes. Good question again. Very good question again. Other questions?
Is there more information on defense in the future, or?
Is there more information about the defense?
Yes.
Generally, the information that comes forward in the defense comes by virtue of your committee.
Oh,
Okay, what happens, generally speaking, so that you know, a defense is a defense on what it is that you have written. It is not an examination of everything that you have ever learned, or what you haven't learned, in CRP. Okay, and so it's dedicated in that respect. It is also, generally speaking, meant to be an opportunity to allow you to reflect as an outside observer on what it is you have learned in the process. Okay? What you might have learned that you didn't anticipate you were going to learn when you started this adventure. And that's what it is. It's an adventure. It's an adventure in learning. Mike.
Fair to say that a defense is generally not scheduled unless somebody